Once again, I want to thank everyone from the Italian Embassy and the Cultural Institute for making this all possible. My name is Nikolas Diakolios, and I'm an alumnus of GW. I want to start us off with a quote about Piranesi. In 1789, the famed German writer Johann Wolfgang von Goethe traveled to Italy, but not everything was as he had pictured it. This time our eyes greeted the Pyramid of Cestius from the outside, and the actual appearance of the ruined baths of Antinous, or Caracalla, of which Piranesi has given us so many a rich imaginary impression, could hardly satisfy even our artistically trained eye. Anyone who's seen the Mona Lisa in person knows that feeling. Oh, I guess this is what I came all this way for. For the record, Goethe's disappointment isn't entirely unfounded. Piranesi made a number of impressions of the baths of Caracalla, but this is one of them. It's a beautiful impression, even if it is a little bit embellished. You can understand why Goethe would be a little disappointed. There's good reason for why Piranesi chose to portray the baths in this more elaborate way, and why a contemporary biographer of his, Bianconi, referred to him as the Rembrandt of ancient ruins. A lot of it comes down to his audience. Like how students today might take a graduation trip or a gap year, young aristocrats of Europe, after finishing their schooling, would travel across the continent for months or even over a year, until the widespread adoption of rail travel, young, primarily men, accompanied by a family member or tutor, would go to see the art, hear the music, and experience the places that they spent years learning about. They called it the Grand Tour. Italy was a main focus, and Rome especially was a key destination. This is the culture where Piranesi emerges, and this is what funded his career. People of means on the Grand Tour wanted souvenirs of their time in Rome, a memento from this rite of passage. Piranesi didn't have any patrons, but he had a market. He knew the type of person looking to buy Prince of Rome, travelers on the Grand Tour. And what better memento from this seminal adventure of your youth than a beautiful print of the places you've come to see. When the years have passed, there will still be this image of the places that you've gone. Piranesi knew his audience, and you can see it in the prints themselves. Behind me is Piranesi's depiction of Paestum. It was originally founded by Greek colonists just south of Naples. It was incorporated to the growing Roman Empire in the 3rd century BC. The structure you see is the first of 2 temples to Hera, with the second one in the background to the left. There's a sense of forgotten beauty in the way Piranesi depicts these temples. Derelict and overgrown with weeds that come shooting out from every crack. The dirt that covers the once sacred floors is now used for grazing goats. The toppled columns that once held the roof aloft are nothing more than seating for a weary goat herder. The message here is blunt. The temple serves a different purpose now. Once it was the site of ceremony and ritual, now it's a stomping ground for common folk and livestock. Though it's filled with people, few are really that interested in the ruins themselves. The disinterest of the folk in the print creates a sense for his educated audience of going where other learned people do not. It's an adventure. You've gone somewhere hidden, somewhere forgotten. Now, in reality, that's not strictly true. The site of Paestum was popular for travelers on the Grand Tour. It was listed on a number of itineraries, and it's near other famous sites like Pompeii and Herculaneum, whose recent discovery had spurred on even more interest in the classics. Even in Piranesi's time, Paestum was far from forgotten. So why depict it like it's some long-lost temple that has sat unstudied for a millennia? Well, Piranesi sells you on the idea of adventure. When you're finished with the Grand Tour and finally return home, you'll have a memento of this adventure you went on. He does a lot to play into this. He focuses on the most dramatic point of view, putting the viewer inside the temple. He evokes the grandeur of viewing the sights in person. In truth, a lot of this view of Paestum is shared by a modern postcard. It is intended primarily for a foreign audience. The picturesque perspective highlights this sense of adventure. It deliberately targets tourists looking for a keepsake from their time in Italy. This is a tried and true practice for Piranesi. This view of Paestum comes from the very end of his career. And he'd been using the same technique in his earlier works, like the interior view of the cavern of Aquaverdo. The Aquaverdo runs for miles, both above and below ground, and it was one of the 11 great aqueducts that provided fresh water to the ancient city. Here we can see again, Piranesi is presenting the cavern as a vast monument which goes unappreciated. One of the most famous aqueducts of Rome, Piranesi shows is overgrown and disregarded. The water spills out, evoking the image of a hidden natural spring rather than a painstakingly constructed monument to Roman engineering. It's cared for so little that the massive inscription along the wall has almost been completely covered by hanging vines. The only few figures depicted show indifference, continuing their labors and whatever tasks they have at hand. Much like the temples of Hera at Paestum, the Aquaverdo is not nearly as forgotten as Piranesi's impressions may make it seem. There's been a major aqueduct of Rome for over 2,000 years. It feeds a number of iconic fountains in the city, and most famously, the Aquaverdo provides the water for the Fonte di Trevi. In the upper left is the Fonte di Trevi as is today. In the upper right is one of Piranesi's impressions of the fountain. Here too we can see Piranesi chooses a postcard perspective that amplifies the magnitude of these edifices, placing his viewer at the side of the fountain as if you're approaching it from coming off a side street. Compare this to his predecessor and mentor, Giuseppe Vassi, whose impression is at the bottom right. You can see how Piranesi highlights the dynamic nature of the fountain through his point of view. The more you look at Piranesi's work, the harder it becomes to take photos that have composition nearly as entrancing as his prints. Elements of his work are exaggerated. He sometimes distorts the composition or point of view to create a more eye-catching piece. I'm not accusing him of dishonesty, I really can't. He says it himself. I will tell you only that these speaking ruins have filled my spirit with images that accurate drawings, even those of the immortal Palladio, could never have succeeded in conveying, though I always kept them before my eyes. He exaggerates some elements, but he does it to evoke emotion, the emotion you felt being there. Even if the memories of your grand tour have become hazy, Piranesi preserves the feelings you had being on it. He never intended to make perfectly accurate accounts of what exactly these sites look like. He had the skill, and he was trained as an architect. He could have if he had wanted to. But that's why his work has stood the test of time, because he conveys a feeling that any tourist is familiar with. Piranesi preserves the awe and adventure you feel being in a foreign land and among its ancient ruins. Every postcard and every tourist photo that aims to capture the majesty of an architectural wonder or a historied ruin attempts to emulate Piranesi, knowingly or not. Now, before I finish, I just want to thank Yashwant Singh and Alyssa Jung, who are the contributors who wrote the catalog entries on Paestum and Aquaverdo. If you want to learn more about these two pieces, you can read their entries on the exhibition website, and I also encourage you to see the exhibit in person while it's still up. So, thank you.
Nikolas, thank you very, very much. Wonderful, and I'll explain in a second, but just I've been referred to a number of times by name, and I just wanted to say what a joy it is for me to be here this evening at Rachel's invitation, at Michele and Electra's invitation. I couldn't resist the idea of not just Piranesi, my love of really earlier Italian art is really my own expertise, my scholarship, my principal concern, that is of the 16th, 17th century. But Piranesi, all the critical contexts that concern me in earlier Italian art really come to a grand finale in Piranesi. The printmaking, more painterly approach to printmaking, the fascination with the ancient world and its trying to understand its forms, but also what those forms express, what those forms mean. More immediately, or more personally, the National Gallery of Art, some of you know, has one of the great collections in the world of Piranesi's prints and some of his greatest drawings. And I am now 2 years away from the gallery, and so the prospect of thinking about Piranesi and with you all was appealing, had that appeal. Also, very personally, I'm just back from Rome, and thinking of this evening was looking around with very much what you're describing, Nikolas, sort of with eyes conditioned by Piranesi. Whether you've been in a better hotel or whether you even own some Piranesi prints yourself. He conditions our eye, again, in the way, Nikolas, you were saying. And then one more personal note is that not just a curator scholar, but I am a collector. I'm an avid collector, and I have recently parted with my own collection. For all kinds of reasons that have to do with the market. It would be another evening. It would be a whole discussion, and some of it confessional, and some about the art market, and some about the state of our society and how the Western tradition is perceived and what it augurs, at least for much of the rest of my lifetime. But to say, a number of Piranesis came off my walls about 2 months ago. And so that was an additional reason that I wanted to be involved this evening, and I'm so grateful. Nikolas, wonderful comments, and two things. Well, you've said it. Piranesi in the tradition of the Grand Tour. Piranesi as producing an incomparable corpus for the tourist, for the educated, the cultured tourist of the day, and that's something we go back and forth a little more about. And the other is you're evoking the experience of the individual of the day and refracting that through your own relation to Piranesi, which I think is wonderful. Could you comment more about the sort of that tradition of the Grand Tour and images of Roman ruins in particular, and maybe go to the first, if you go to the next slide, I think, as we've set it up. Yeah. There are just a couple of things to key, and we can talk back and forth about.
Sure, I'd love to. I find the Grand Tour fascinating because it can feel very far away. Piranesi was producing roughly at the time of the American Revolution, which, us in America kind of feels very long ago. But it really, when you think about the tradition of the Grand Tour, is not that far off from a gap year. A lot of high schoolers will graduate, and I knew people at GW who did that. Graduate high school, spend a year globetrotting, sometimes you do it after college. And I think that really does speak to us now, and you can see that, where you're seeing the world, you've gotten an education, you're a little more worldly, but you need that real life experience of going to those places to really have it come full circle. And so I think that's what is really interesting about Piranesi in the context of the Grand Tour, because we're still doing it today, and that's why it still speaks to us.
Both conditioning before one travels, and of course as to reminisce, to remember, and to further shape, to tether one's impressions, conditioning. I chose these two images just on the left is one of the earliest, really the earliest set, comes from the earliest set of etchings that interpret the Roman ruins. And there you have, it's an Antwerp publisher named Hieronymus Koch, who's also the etcher of a series of 12 views in 1550, very early on. There are drawings of Roman ruins from before that, but this is really the first of a long line of such series. 12 in that set. By the end of the 16th century, there are 3-4 other such sets. And Piranesi is, again, this sort of culmination of that. Whole tradition as well, you mentioned Vassi, and perhaps talk more about contemporary renderings of, of modern architecture, that is, contemporary architecture.
It's really interesting because I know Fiona touched on this earlier. You see it in Vassi's work too, the way that Piranesi carved parallel lines to make the prints last longer. You can see a lot of that in Vassi's work as well. And so I think that's really interesting. You see what is passed down mentor to student. But I really like the Fonte di Trevi etchings because it shows Vassi has this very factual approach to it. I'm going to present it as it is. When you go home, you will have the image as it is. Piranesi takes the emotional approach, and he says, no, I want you to remember what it felt like to smell the water in the fountain.
No, excellent. And Vazi's series, there are 240 in these small plates. They're small scale plates. And they are, just as you described, Nikolas, they are factual. I mean, they are more conventional sort of architectural renderings. Can you go to the next slide?
Mm-hmm.
Here's another tradition, expands further, I think, and just to say in terms of preparing sort of comments our conversation, I looked at your images and sort of thought, what do they key and how might we in conversation explain more of the context of Piranesi or the particular Piranesi you're showing. Two more here that relate to or epitomize the tradition of not just rendering architecture or recreating ancient Roman architecture or contemporary architecture, but series of prints that were intended to give the owner, the viewer, the sensation of passing through space. It's a whole, really, it wants to really stretch it. It's a sort of ancestor almost of travel documentary films, or the kind of videos we make. One of the earliest examples there on the left by a Dutch, a North Netherlandish printmaker and publisher, a series of 12, which he titled, I've translated it here, but he titled it Pleasant Places Around Haarlem. And the views are not of spectacular or familiar monuments. They give you a sense of topography and moving through it. And they were intended, there's a frontispiece that describes a bit, they were intended to give the viewer the sensation of recreating the experience. And that carries forward into the 18th century, in fact, is wonderfully expanded in the 18th century, and by a critical precursor and really inspiration for Piranesi in this spirit, not of architectural recreation or interpretation, but of giving movement through space and giving that dynamic sense, the dynamic sense of memory. The etcher and actually imaginary architectural etcher named Giovanni Francesco Costa. He publishes in 1750, second volume in 1762, a series of 130 plates that evoke. They are views ostensibly of the major Venetian family's palaces along the Brenta River that runs basically from the Piranesi territory down to Venice. But what they give is the sense of movement through space. So this sort of ancestor of our, again, our videos, this documentary. But I thought those would just elaborate, put in further context what I knew you were going to describe. And beautifully. Thank you. In the spirit of conversation, I mean, back and forth, it's not just my...
Oh, I would say that I did look at your images as well. In the Costa, I really like the way the boats are positioned, that you can almost feel them moving. And I would say that that does show out in Piranesi's work. In the Paestum engraving, I really love the goats. It's just such a fun little detail because, if you've been to Greece and Italy, sometimes the goats will find their way into a space. And so it gives character to it and it gives motion. And I think that that's what you're trying to evoke here.
Yeah, animation. Animation as critical part of memory, and that becomes more and more, of course, by our stage. We're videoing videoing and immediately transmitting our dinners, our movement through all kinds of space. We're stumbling into one another in museums and monuments. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Whenever there's something Dutch, I get very excited, especially 17th century Dutch. For those of my students out there in my Dutch art class right now, just to see that you brought up Paul Vischer's Pleasant Places. And that particular edition was published in the midst of the 12-year truce, the break in hostilities during the 80 Years' War. And it's really important to bring this one up because Vischer calls to the readers and the viewers of his series, look upon these pleasant places. And to look upon, their land that they have now earned, they're breaking free from Spanish control. This is a break in the hostilities from the war. They have true love for the land that they're seeing. And the Dutch were using a term for the first time, which is schilderachtig, worthy of a picture. And the sense of when you look at a Dutch landscape, even when you go to a beautiful place, we say that. You look out the window, oh, it's worthy of a picture. I'm going to take a snapshot of it. And it's starting with the Dutch in the 17th century and continuing on into Piranesi with the notion of the picturesque and the sublime to come.